All right, good evening, everyone, or afternoon or morning, whenever you're choosing to watch this. This is our makeup class for the snow days that we missed, one of the two. This one is going to be focusing on what trauma does to attachment, right? How experiencing traumatic experiences, whether they be complex trauma or like relational trauma in regards to physical, sexual, emotional abuse, things like bullying, things that alter our ability to attach and connect with others, or large T trauma, which is sometimes what they consider broader things that are experienced by multiple people, like natural disasters, fires, combat, things of that nature. I'm going to be reading off some notes, not entirely. I'll be talking a lot, but talking a little bit from the notes here because I just want to make sure that I'm on track with everything that we're going to go through here. So if you see me kind of my eyes bouncing all over the place, that'll explain why that is. But I'm going to try to be brief, and as most of you know, that's kind of an issue for me. So let's just jump right in. So when we talk about the concept of trauma and its impact on attachment, we can't not talk about attachment theory because that's basically what we're talking about. And I'm sure that you all have learned sort of a basic understanding of what attachment theory is, that it's based on infant mother dyads and exploring how those early connections, usually within the first couple of years of life, can sometimes set us up for our method of attachment throughout life. Recently, with more and more attention on the adverse childhood experience studies, looking at how these early adverse events, everything from losing a parent to physical and emotional abuse to childhood injury, childhood surgery, all these different types of things, they alter the way that even an infant experiences the world. And so we want to start with this concept of attachment. And there's been a lot of really fascinating research in the last 2 decades on attachment and adulthood, like adult attachment. They've come up with wonderful adult attachment scales and surveys, sort of see how adults are attaching to one another. And there's also been a lot of really great and interesting, fascinating neuroscience around the concepts of connections and attachments in ways that we weren't able to study, when Bowlby and Ainsworth were studying the way babies attached, back in the 60s and 70s. So it's a really innovative time. So I want to talk a little bit about some of those recent studies, but first to just kind of get a basic understanding of what we're talking about when we're talking about attachment. And so what we mean when we talk about infant attachment is that sort of reciprocal, enduring emotional and physical affiliation that occurs between a child and a caregiver. And that these attachment behaviors, and this is what we really want to focus in on a little bit today, is these attachment behaviors. Bowlby really believes that at the foundation, attachment behaviors were about a child surviving. So whatever the behavior that the child was exhibiting, it was really about keeping itself alive, because unlike a lot of mammals, we come out attached and need human connection to survive. Like if you think about a horse, it has to be able to stand, walk, run, defend itself, feed itself, see, all within a couple of hours of birth. When humans, because of the size of our head and our brain, the constant development of the brain, we're born sort of still in the womb, and we need a couple of years before we can get to the point where the horse is within a couple of hours. So there's something really unique about our species in that we are born to connect. We're born with a need to look out at the world in order to define ourselves. And the first person, theoretically, that we would do that with would be our mother. And I know that depending upon circumstance in life, not everyone is raised by their mother. Not everyone has those attachment connections. Even some more modern techniques of birth really do keep that initial attachment moment from happening. The beauty of attachment and the theory itself is that it suggests that attachment can be repaired. That even if we have a really awful attachment experience in infancy, as we grow up as an adult, things can change it for the better. Things can also change it for the worse, and that's sort of what we're going to talk about today. But I've always liked it because it's an optimistic theory. They came up with the concept of rupture is fine as long as there's repair. And so as clinicians and therapists, one of our goals is to help help create that repair environment, an environment where they can connect and attach with a safe object that isn't going to abuse them, that isn't going to take advantage of them or exploit them. And in that way, we can help repair some of the ruptures from the past. And so the beauty of the attachment theory is that it happens super early, right? Like usually within the first 7 months, we really start to see a lot of those things. And this is why the focus of the research has always been on the infant, because the infant's brain is incredibly interesting. I mean, the brain is born sort of undifferentiated. It grows more in the few years right after birth than it ever will again. It's making like unbelievable amount of neural potential growth, like right in those moments. It's looking at the world. It's trying to discover in sort of an epigenetic way, who am I and why am I here? And so the first eyes that they see, that these mirror neurons begin to fire, and these neuropeptides like oxytocin, they begin to connect us and to the world, right? Because if you think about the baby's life before birth, it's very isolated in a way. It's incredibly connected and at the same time very isolated. When it gets out into the world, there's this need for to start to connect to the objects that are going to come randomly out there. And it's a slow process. At first, everything feels like one experience to a baby. And then over time, as they get more hippocampal functioning and they move from explicit memory to implicit, where they can start to really differentiate one object to the other. But those early attachment moments are really powerful and really, really important in how a child starts to organize their life. And the other thing that occurs is that behavior has to take on a new level. Inside the womb, it's very chemical oriented. It's very needs based. There's like one very real powerful connective tool in that umbilical cord that allows so much of the needs of the baby to be communicated, right? And then when we get out, they literally cut the cord, right? And now we're sort of on our own, and the baby has to create behaviors that'll increase its ability to survive. And so in attachment theory, we call these attachment behaviors. And what they really are, and I'll use the term mother-child a lot in this because that's where the research really focuses. But understand that this can be carried over in any type of primary care relationship that a child finds itself. So these behaviors are an attempt to achieve physical and psychological contact. That's simple, right? And what I want to sort of take us into thinking is like our clients that we see as adults, how we might be able to start to look at some of the behavior that is traditionally considered manipulative or acting out, or whatever derogatory term agencies tend to use to sort of define behavior. What if we looked at it as attachment behavior? How might that change the lens with which we see the people we're working with if we were thinking this behavior is actually an attempt to increase physical or psychological contact with whomever the attachment figure is at that moment in their life? It starts to broaden it up and open it in a different direction. So signaling behaviors by the child that indicate to the mother that the child is interested in social interaction. That's one type of behavior, right? So it can be sort of those little coos or the reaching, the grabbing, asking to be picked up. Those are attachment behaviors. Adverse behaviors, crying, screaming, yelling, kicking things. Those can be behaviors that call the mother in because the baby's in distress. There can be active behaviors that take the child to the mother, like trying to crawl, trying to reach, all of those things. And so when we think about that, we have to ask ourselves, like, what is the need going on there, right? So what is the source of anxiety, right? And this comes back to attachment theory being born and using some similar language to some of the earlier drive theories. It wasn't a complete departure yet. But so we are still talking about that anxiety. And in many ways, that anxiety in the infant is Freud would define it as very id-like, right? Like the basic needs, I want what I want, give it to me, or I become neurotic, right? And so with a child, those sources of anxiety tend to be physical. So they could be feeling sick, they could be tired, they could be hungry, they could be hurt. And when those physical things come up, well, then it's like, bring mommy to me. Bring the caregiver to me. Bring the person who can soothe my illness, who can protect me while I nap, can feed me. can tend to my wounds, right? Take care of my physical space, my physical self. The other source of anxiety would be within the environment. Anything that's frightening to the child, loud noises, dogs barking, anything that could be a threat, or something that might be really confusing. Sometimes when a mother goes to the bathroom, the child loses its mind, right? Because it doesn't have object constancy yet, and it doesn't understand that mommy's in a room and mommy will come back. In that moment, it's very confusing and terrifying because it feels like mommy has left the universe. And in attachment theory, they really played around with these ideas of environmental changes to attachment to sort of gauge and assess a child's attachment. And the strange experiment, for those who aren't familiar, a child and the mother would be placed in a playroom, and the baby would be put on the ground, and the baby would be allowed to play. And they would notice how the baby interacted with mom, how the attachment to mom allowed the baby either confidence or fear of exploring the playroom. And then they would introduce a stranger, someone who would just come in, sit down with mom, and start talking. They would behave, they'd be friendly, it'd be a nice relationship, and they'd watch how the baby reacted to the stranger. And generally, baby looks to mom. If mom's okay, then baby's okay, right? That would be sort of an attached or a secure attachment. But if the baby started to get upset, if the baby started to get scared, they'd make a note of that to sort of say, well, what was going on there? And that's fine if it was. That's anxiety. That's environmental anxiety. But what does the baby do in relation to its primary caregiver when it's startled, when it's scared, when it's afraid? Then at some point, they would have mom just get up and leave, and they would watch how baby reacted to mom leaving. And so this is where they started to really look at, how babies manage their anxiety in absence of their caregiver. So, it's normal for them to cry. It's normal for them to run after mom or try to get her back. They'll use some of their behavioral skills. But then eventually, how do they self-regulate, right? Do they avoid? Do they shut down? Do they numb out? Do they become disorganized? And they would watch those things within there. And then they'd have mom come back and they'd notice how the baby reattaches, right? So rupture is fine as long as there's repair. And the re-engagement phase was really more the important one. Was baby mad at mom? Was baby violent towards mom? Was baby ignoring mom? Did baby run up to mom? All of those different things help the theorists come up with these categories of attachment within young children. So the last level is of sources of anxiety really is distance and connection to the caregiver. So within the attachment figure, within mom, does mom create uncertainties about location, or is there behavior that confuses mom to the point where the baby can't trust that the attachment is solid? Because if the baby can't trust that the attachment is solid, the baby loses the contours of itself. All right. At this young age, they're still trying to figure out, where do I end and where do these other objects begin? And if mom can't give me that feedback, I have to self-define it. And that's where we see sort of big and little behavior within kids, right? And so we're looking at how, more about attachment behavior. We're looking at the amount of time it takes baby to find relief from the anxiety. And this is important for us as therapists and as helpers, because these are things that we can apply to the work that we're doing, right? So one of the big ones the big things that they found were helpful in helping kids relieve that anxiety were sensitivity from the caregiver, acceptance from the caregiver, cooperation, accessibility, and availability, right? And so when we think about ourselves as therapists, as helpers in any way, even if it's just case managers, and I don't mean just case managers, but I mean, even if we're just doing concrete supportive stuff as opposed to like depth psychotherapy and stuff like that, sensitivity, acceptance, cooperation, accessibility, availability, that creates an attachment framework that reduces anxiety. So if you have a client coming in and you're helping people complete applications for SNAP benefits or Medicaid, and you can apply a level of sensitivity, acceptance, cooperation, accessibility, and availability, how likely might that be to reduce their anxiety about a meeting like that? And this goes anywhere, like even in our therapy sessions, especially in initial meetings, if we can create that attachment environment, how much more engaged and how less anxious might those clients be, right? And so when we can't get away from talking about brain development when we're talking about children, because so much of it is happening so quickly, right? I mean, most neural network development occurs after birth. So, I mean, we have a lot going on in our bodies. Our entire body is forming in the womb, including the brain, the heart, all those things. But when we get out, this is where we see most of the development occur, because the brain is a social organ. It needs to see out into the world in order to calibrate and figure out who it is, right? It's sort of like if anyone's ever read the story The Ugly Duckling, it's a very great attachment story, right? The ugly duckling doesn't have an attachment figure after birth, sort of wanders through the world, looking out at the world, not to see the world, but to see itself. And every animal it comes across, it thinks, oh, well, I must be a frog because I'm seeing a frog. And attachment works that way, especially when we don't have a primary attachment figure that is giving us the ability to find our contours in relation to their contours. So the brains are built from the bottom up. We've talked about that. So survival needs come first, and then over the course of childhood, tweenhood, and adolescence, we get to the point where everything's grown from the cerebellum all the way through to the neocortex, and everything's online, hopefully at the same level, unless there's been some sort of disruptions or injuries. So after birth, the speed, which I think is just fascinating, you have about 700 new neural connections per second. I mean, that's just an incredible amount of learning that's happening during infancy. And so much of it is geared towards the connections to the attachment figures. You know, a lot of times we talk about genetic predispositions, but genetics really just supply a basic blueprint, right, for what it is to be human, what it is to be this individual specific human coming from this specific human lineage. But the connections that we make neurobiologically are really what start to utilize that genetic underpinning to move us in and through the world. And so all of the connections, those 700 neural connections per hour, what was it, did I say per hour, I think? All of those per second, I'm so sorry. They're going through a constant state of pruning. You know, a lot of times people want to compare the human brain to a computer, like serial parallel ports, and some of it holds up. But when we talk about neural growth, it's much more like watching a forest grow, right? So even the axons and dendrites, the brain cells, look a little bit like branches, and they're moving towards each other through almost the same way that a tree would grow towards the light. We grow towards connections. So as these connections are being either increased or reduced, there's a process called neural pruning. If there's an old saying in neuroscience, if you don't use it, you lose it. And that's kind of true. Like a baby, when they're born, those little sounds that they make, the gurgles and the clicks, possess all of the necessary nuance to speak every human language. And depending on what environment they're dropped in, they learn that language and they prune off the other abilities and some of those other sounds in order to hone in on a specific language. But during youth, that's the best time to learn multiple languages, because the brain is still designed to do that massive experiential learning from hearing it and then being able to integrate it, right? But if we don't, then the brain prunes. It starts to grow in specific directions based on the connections that it's presented with. So in this way, you have the blueprint of the genes, but the brain itself is going to start to determine what neurons are pruned, and that creates sort of the basic structure of the brain, but also the basic structure of some levels of identity. So at the level of mind, attachment will establish interpersonal relationships, and those help that sort of, I hate the word immature, but that young brain use more mature functions of the parent's brain to organize its own process, right? So if I think about it often with like seeing a scary dog, right? A big dog's bigger than the child, and the child's very terrified. But if the mother or the father goes and pets the dog, then the baby is able to self-regulate, right? It's able to regulate down by watching the mature response of the parent, that youthful response, that immature response of a developing young brain, is able to grow through watching the caregivers interact with the world. So that's really powerful, right? So there is this game that starts to happen within the brain development. The baby wants to start to interact with that primary caregiver to get the needs met. So we have like what we call serve and return relationships, and that those are so vital for development. And those are really like, I cry, you come, right? Like you arrive. This is where, you know, some doctors tell people leave the baby in the crib, let it cry itself to sleep. It's learning to self-soothe. But in a way, it's also learning that, you know, my language doesn't work, right? Because at that moment, all that they have are their voices. All they have are those primitive attachment behaviors, right? And if they're in the crib and they're crying, they're trying to use the voice to play, serve, and return. And, you know, so life provides enough opportunities for natural rupture and repair. We don't necessarily have to create them. Young children are reaching out for integration through babbling, facial expressions, gestures. If the responses are unreliable or inappropriate, the architecture does not form as expected. So basically what we're saying is if baby reaches out and mommy is not able to return, and that happens repetitively over and over again, the baby's attachment paradigm starts to shift in a maladjusted way, right? For lack of a better term. So we start to see like avoidant attachment styles or ambiguous or ambivalent attachment styles or even disorganized. And some of the things that can cause that are, you know, mother having her own mental health issues, cognitive issues within mom, you know, just not having time to return. You know, all of those different things can affect the way that the child in those early developmental stages starts to attach. So I want to kind of go through. So these ideas, right? Secure, insecure, disorganized. Those are sort of the attachment patterns that we think about the most. Secure being, you know, the child has gotten everything that it needed from the caregiver. Not perfect. I mean, the one of the wonderful terms that came out of attachment theory is the good enough parent. And it just simply says you don't have to be perfect. You just have to be good enough. You have to provide the child with enough rupture so they learn how to repair, but not so much unrepaired rupture that the child no longer feels safe in the world. Because if they don't feel secure, they feel insecure. And if they feel insecure for too long, then the disruption can create a very disorganized personality structure within the child, because they don't know where their contours end and the rest of the world's begin. And this becomes more and more challenging as they start to move into larger social realms where there's going to be more objects that they don't know how to connect with. And usually that's when we start to see folks in elementary school or even high school coming in really having trouble with socialization. So in the disorganized type, the self is confused and bad and other people are frightening and unavailable. That's the infant sort of feeling. As I'm starting to talk about this disorganized attachment pattern, I want you to think about the behavior and symptoms of PTSD, but also of what you're learning about borderline personality disorder, because these two share a very common denominator. So the idea in the infant is that the self is confused and bad, and other people are frightening and unavailable. So I'm confused and I lack worth. I'm the problem, and other people are terrifying and won't show up when I need them. The child doesn't really develop attachment strategies to decrease anxiety or gain emotional proximity or understanding or increase the sense of self of security. So they don't develop those tools of relating to other people. And they have no attachment strategy to deal with distress. And so it's very, very hard for them to regulate their anxious self. Right. And so what do we call that when we talk about borderline personality disorder? Affect dysregulation. So we can start to see that happening in infancy as it moves along. So let me fly ahead in my notes a little bit because I've already noticed that I'm rambling on a bit. So I want to get to where we start to talk about when we start talking about trauma. So adult attachment, right? So they did a really fascinating study. They took 2,000 infant parent pairs and the study ran from 1970 to 1996. And they found that only 55% of us have secure attachment, so only slightly more than half. The other 45% of us suffer from insecure attachment, which means that 45 have difficulty making and sustaining a committed, stable relationship as adults. Um, and that we also pass this emotional pain to children who turn out in a similar way. So when you're doing like a genogram with a client, you're starting to see sort of relational patterns of things, like divorce or abandonment repeating in the paradigm. This adult attachment study starts to suggest that some of this might be generational attachment programs and processes. When we see families that seem to go generationally, having children taken away by adult protective services. Now, obviously, there's a lot of systemic issues, a lot of racism that's involved in how families are torn apart by certain systems. But when we see that over and over again, we've got to ask ourselves what type of environmental structural damage could cause these types of attachment issues. And recently, in the last 10 or 20 years, they've been studying more around culture and attachment, and how things like within Native American families, how reform schools where children were taken away and reconditioned to force assimilate into white culture, that has had an impact on attachment through the years. Slavery obviously having a huge impact on attachment. And paradigms and feeling safe in the world. So those are really the things. We're looking to our primary caregiver to figure out how we can feel safe in relationships and within the world. And if you can't, then, it is hard to find those boundaries, those contours. So disrupted attachment, that's where an attachment figure is perceived as unavailable and the result of a substantial unplanned separation. So those of you who have heard lectures on ambiguous loss, this would make a little bit of sense that ambiguous loss can have a direct impact on that, right? So what are some of the things that cause this traditionally in families that have been, at least the stuff that's been studied? Illness and injury. And I want you to think about the context of ambiguous loss and some of the things we talked about with that. Illness and injury, divorce, military service, imprisonment, mental illness, substance abuse. So a lot of the things that we see our clients dealing with or having experienced are things that can directly disrupt our attachment style. And so you're born with a good attachment. You come out strong and your parent is doing well for a little bit and then all of a sudden gets sick or injured and isn't able to react to your attachment behavior the same way. It shakes up and it disrupts our attachment. Divorce, where a child has, especially the younger children, have gotten used to two caregivers or multiple supports, all of a sudden that's changed. It disrupts the attachment. Military service, imprisonment, this is where someone is physically alive but not physically present, emotionally alive but not emotionally present. Same thing can be said with mental illness and substance use. So things that disrupt the relational connection. So really, the next piece of this is where we start to talk about relational trauma, right? Like attachment injuries that occur when the person feels abandoned by an attachment figure at the time of crisis. So I'd like to think about this one in regards to being a young teenager, right? And your best friend backstabs you or turns on you or bullies you to get favor somewhere else, right? Sounds like an after school special, but it actually happens a lot. And that level of abandonment and bullying, that can really disrupt a person's ability to attach to that social surrounding. And it can create sort of a need to find a new way of self-soothing or a new way of reducing that rejection anxiety. So it can affect our attachment. And adolescence, we all know, is known as the second attachment phase. So then we talk about, finally, Steve, after like a year, we get to the concept of attachment trauma. And this is when the attachment figure is the source of the trauma. So this is a very different and unique concept. Attachment trauma means that the trauma itself is coming from the attachment figure. So these are things like child or physical abuse, child physical abuse, sexual abuse, neglect, domestic violence, abandonment. And these start to create a sort of a toxic casserole within the brain. We notice that children who have experienced those tend to have a smaller brain. That doesn't mean that they're not as smart, but when we see a size differential in the brain, it means usually that that the liquid chemicals of the brain, water, I think it's called myelin, um, and blood, are being diverted to other areas and not other areas that are more involved um, in attachment and relationship. It's more slips back into the survival part of the brain. So we see a lot of chronic hyperarousal, learning, memory, language issues, developmental insults and delays or distortions. Stress hormones affect immunity in the whole body. So we start to see kids acting out more from the chronic hyperarousal. We see these symptoms that are often referred to as oppositional defiant disorder, or conduct disorders, or ADHD, or even sometimes borderline personality disorders, or any type of personality structural disorders. We see, delays in memory and language. We start to see reading comprehension issues, developmental insults and delays and distortions. All of those things that they're getting sent to a doctor for may simply be the result of, not simply, but may be the result of these attachment traumas. But oftentimes the environment isn't as explored as the child is. Like, we tend to locate the problem within the kid and try to focus the intervention there, as opposed to somewhere environmentally. So it changes the brain. And that's sort of the takeaway of that. And we get again into the adverse childhood experience studies, and what we're trying to figure out about that. In 1998, largest study of its kind, almost 18,000 participants that have examined the health and social effects of adverse childhood experience over the lifespan. The majority of the participants were 50 or older, 62% were white and had attended college, 72% had attended college. I wish I had more details on that, on who was actually studied within that population, but it was limited in some of those demographic areas. So the categories that they were looking for: when you were 18 years or younger, they're looking for incidences of physical, sexual, emotional abuse, physical or emotional neglect. That was the abuse that they were looking at. Within the household, they were looking at mental illness, substance abuse, domestic violence, parental separation or divorce, or incarceration. And those were sort of the ACEs that they were looking at. You got 1 point per category to get your total ACEs score. And so what they found was that 36% had no ACEs scores whatsoever. 26% had 1 ACE, 16% had 2, 3, 10% had 3, and 7% had 4 or more. What's interesting about that is that those do line up pretty well with those studies on attachment that broke it down to, how many people have secure attachment, insecure, disorganized. So they basically said that given an exposure to one category, there's an 80% likelihood of exposure to another, so that the ACEs sort of stacked. As the numbers increased, the number of comorbid conditions increased. So when we look at that, the ACEs score of 4 or more, that was the big one. They found that folks were twice as likely to smoke, 7 times more likely to have problems with alcohol, 6 times more likely to have had sex before the age of 15, twice as likely to have been diagnosed with cancer, twice as likely to have had heart disease, 4 times as likely to suffer from emphysema or chronic bronchitis, 12 times as likely to have attempted suicide, 10 times more likely to have injected street drugs. So those are big, major revelations from these studies, right? That these events that happen in childhood actually can affect directly our physical health later on, right? So the bigger piece here is that what we're hearing is that ACEs tells us what we need to know about what is causing the effects that we're seeing in our clients. And on a broader spectrum, what's happening within society that is making our clients sick. It's more like a germ theory, looking at sort of violence as the germ that is infecting the world. And the effects of it usually get displaced onto children more than anything else. There's no darker period or darker time in humankind than really looking at the way we treat children and have treated them, throughout time. So context matters: physical context, developmental context, multi-generational context, emotional, social, economic, political, philosophical, religious, spiritual, creative, transformative. All those things play into what the ACEs was really demonstrating. It was sort of finally the answer to nature versus nurture, and the answer was they interact. That we have an existence, that we have an identity, that we struggle within those connections due to both nature and nurture, the environments we're placed in, and that genetic blueprint that we're born with. So ACEs is telling us that these things are common, they're highly interrelated, they pile up, have a cumulative impact. There's biological plausibility. And it gave us a language that was pretty easy to talk about. I mean, every one of us should be giving our clients an ACEs quiz just so that we can kind of get an idea of, what's happened in the past, but also what might be happening in the future. And then on a larger side, we have to be the activist therapist who takes this information and tries to do something that changes the social structure that's allowing these things to happen. We have to look at the impacts of community violence, witnessed intentional violence, over-policed neighborhoods, all of those different things. We've got to look at how they interact with the development of ACEs, because these parents are living in a world that might make them feel unsafe, that might make them feel like they can't necessarily cope. And then that stress, that parental stress, brings to bear on the development of the child. And we know that through watching parental stress studies when the baby is still in utero. But looking, we know that high levels of stress decrease the levels of serotonin and dopamine in the newborn. They have greater right frontal activation, lower vagal tone, and a variety of growth delays based on stress. The changes correlate with emotional dysregulation, depression, anxiety. Those are those regions of the brain. Attachment difficulties are almost preborn when a parent is under a great deal of stress. Then we have the concept of maternal depression, these ideas of postpartum. The mother has more of a blank affect, and the child is looking directly at the face to get some sense of the world. So the inability to sort of attune to the feelings and needs of the child, her levels of energy, all of those things that would make it harder for her to show up when the baby requests attachment through attachment behavior, starts to dysregulate the child. And so we've noticed that mothers who are less active, children spend more time in states of protest, exhibit more gaze aversion, the child spends less time exploring, likes to speak motherese, shows longer habituation times, express more anger, the child exhibits fewer facial. So there's a lot of opposite reactions when we have mothers who are going through things. Or caregivers in general. I keep using the word mother because the research does, but caregivers in general, when they're under more stress and they're not able to give the appropriate attachment energy to a child, it affects the child moving forward, right? And so some might try to put the blame onto the mother, but that's not enough, right? That we have to look at what society is doing to take care of caregivers, and how that becomes different the more intersectional and dependent upon where a mother happens to be within social positioning, and how relational politics has valued her place in the world versus someone else's, what barriers and what stressors one mother might have that another mother might not. This is where this entire thing becomes a social justice issue in a very powerful way, about how are we taking care of those who are taking care of children. So it's a big major issue. And then, as we look through that, then we talk about interpersonal trauma, and that interpersonal trauma in childhood creates a competing response, a need to cling for support and push away for protection. With borderline personality diagnosed individuals, we call that help insistent, help resistant, right? Where people are asking us to do something for them, and then when we do it, they don't want it. And we feel all sorts of frustrated. Well, I wonder what would happen if you explored the concept of interpersonal trauma in childhood, where they got a message that it wasn't safe to accept help, but at the same time, there's a tremendous need for it. You know, in relational theory, we talk a lot about relational anxiety and relational courage and relational need, and it's sort of the same thing. Like, we all have a desperate need to connect, and we have a fear of connection at the same time. And it takes a lot of relational courage to overcome that fear in order to connect. But if you've experienced interpersonal trauma, it takes a lot more than courage. Right? Early trauma, especially at the hands of the caretaker, this interpersonal trauma. It has like this cascading effect and often manifests in personality disorders. So this is an important piece here because we don't spend enough time educating you all on personality disorders. We focus much more on the mood disorders, much more on the psychotic disorders, depressive anxiety disorders, things like that. We don't talk enough about the spectrum of personality and how that's changed through interaction and relationships. And there's probably a lot of reasons why this isn't taught as much, some political, some curriculum based, but when we start to really think about personality structure that runs that gamut from depressive personality type all the way to psychotic personality type, and then we find these borderline diagnosed clients who are right on the edge, the borderline between neurotic and psychotic, and the behaviors tend to float back and forth between the two. And then we take this attachment lens and we put the other lens of the ACEs over the top of it. All of a sudden, you're starting to really see what psychoanalysts were saying about personality structures for a long time, that what we're really talking about are folks who are regressed to the point of using very immature defense mechanisms. And so when you're seeing someone quote unquote acting out, what you very much might be seeing is someone regressing to the point of those early defense mechanisms. And that's why so many times we infantilize clients with these personality structures, because we believe that they're acting like children, when in reality they may be having like unconscious re-experiencing of those early interpersonal traumas. When you start to look at it this way, we start to really see it creates a different mechanism with which to treat individuals. So the takeaway from this conversation is this, that we are born to attach. We're born with this natural need and this natural desire to connect. And we look out to the world at birth to sort of figure that out. And depending on the eyes that look back, or the inability for a variety of reasons, and we don't want to locate the problem within the parents, but for whatever reason, if that is affected or isn't allowed to manifest in a healthy way, then what we end up seeing is a lot of the problems of youth that enter into the space with us. And hopefully we take this knowledge and we can start to see, all right, well, how does the relationship between me and this person, how can that help to be a reparative experience for people? And this is where attachment theory, object relations, but to me, and this is my own bias because this is the way that I practice, a relational theory, which allows for a really authentic relationship where the power dynamic is a speed bump, not a wall, and where you're really allowing for the individual to get feedback from you about how their behavior impacts the world. You're really focusing on trying to see that individual, to help them recognize the contours of their identity, to live from an authentic space, at the very least in your office. And then hopefully taking some of those skills and then trying them out in the world. So if you go back to the playroom analogy, we want to start to serve as the therapist of first connection, right? So my client feels really good with me, we're talking along, and then I make a suggestion like, we've been talking about substance use and all that stuff, is now the time to try an AA meeting. So in that essence, they might be taking me to that meeting with them. Like, us talking about it and me sort of petting the scary dog in that moment might give them enough confidence to go into that place. Once they're in that place, Then we work on the confidence to connect with people in that place. And once they start to connect with other people, it's like the baby going from toy to toy. The playroom gets so much bigger because of the primary attachment that they started to have with the therapist. That's a really powerful beginning place. Now, we have to remember that just like normal attachment, the idea is to grow away from the attachment figure with confidence and security, but knowing that you can come back in times of stress uh, or problems. But every good parent knows that it's the child's job to outgrow them, right? Khalil Gibran told parents in the book The Prophet, he said, I'm paraphrasing, view yourself as a bow and the child as the arrow. The bow never tries to hold on to the arrow longer than it needs to aim, right? So a parent aims the bow, fires it, and then that was weird. My hand went right into the screen. Then the arrow decides where it lands, right? So it's the same for us as therapists. We want to create that attachment place, but we want to do it with the knowingness and the actual desire of replaceability. Like, we need to know and want eventually the client to no longer need us, so that they can move into their world with more confidence, with a more structured idea of attachment, their own identity in the world, their own abilities, their own sense of self, with a deeper understanding of how to find their own contours, but then also how to recognize and react to the contours of others. And in psychology, there's a whole school of thought called emotional intelligence, which is basically boils down to, I know how I'm feeling, and I react appropriately from that place, and I can recognize how you're feeling, and I can alter my behavior to fit your emotional state, right? And so in a lot of personality structure issues, and even in a lot of more complex mental health issues, that's an area of disintegration, of not really not being able to match our affective response to the physical situation. And hopefully the takeaway from this is that this has a lot to do with how we attach to the world, and that trauma can even take that secure attachment of childhood and really mess around with it and change the way. When we're working with people with trauma, oftentimes they just want to go back to who they were before the event. And the unfortunate thing is that them doesn't exist. And so that's a really hard thing to deal with, because they may have had a very secure sense of identity and the trauma took that away. So then the work is post-traumatic growth. And a lot of that is re-engaging in safe attachment paradigms and relationships that help the individual rediscover their identity. And so in a lot of ways, when we're working with traumatized individuals, we want to remember that we're oftentimes, not all the time, we don't want to paint with too broad of a brush, but oftentimes we're dealing with abused children. And when we understand how trauma sticks in history, we can understand sometimes when the client is acting out, and I hate that term, but when we're seeing those types of behaviors, those attachment-seeking behaviors, those need-seeking behaviors, not attention, but attachment, right? Maybe we can respond with more empathy, more compassion, more understanding, more sensitivity, more availability, more accessibility, as opposed to the opposite. And some of that is understanding our own boundaries, our own contours, our own biases, and being able to work those out in a way that's beneficial to the person that we're working with. So I'll leave you with that. I know it was a little longer than expected. I think maybe, I don't know how long did I go here, but anyway, I'll be posting this up. It'll be up for a limited period of time, a couple of weeks till the end of the semester. I hope that you get something out of it. If you have questions, feel free to bring them to class. Feel free to email me. We can start a private discussion or small groups discussions for folks who want to learn a little bit more. If you do want to dig deeper into this, ask me. I can give you some references for some books or trainings that are really useful. All right. So thank you all so much, and I'll see you in class.